We also see a lot of people come on and, ask like, let me hear about your VBAC story, and positive vibes only. So they only want to hear the positive side. And I understand that mindset, but if you're one way like that, you're going to be so disappointed, especially even if you have your VBAC and something else went wrong. So yeah, I know. So when we do see those posts pop up, and try to be gentle at first, but because people get turned off when you're like, well, no.
Well, I think sometimes what they're looking for is a version of the natural childbirth idea that if you do everything right, it will all work. And it's like, no, somebody else could have everything go right for them and do it. Somebody else could have a lot of things go wrong and still do it. And you could just follow the same path and you'll go somewhere else.
And I think that's what people don't understand. Like, they think that they have control over it, and you can have control over some aspects, but there's some things that just aren't meant to be.
I am in multiple different groups for people who experience birth trauma, which is how I would describe how I felt definitely traumatized by mine. And so I joined those in the months after having my son, and people do one end of the spectrum or the other in there. They're more like me, who I'm repulsed by the idea of people who are so anti intervention and hospitalization and things like that. So it's difficult to have a trauma group like that because you have people whose trauma leads them one way or another. So I don't necessarily think that, for things, as a side note, that for birth trauma, those are really productive, those peer-to-peer groups at all, because really what you need is the help of someone who's licensed, and you can't really mix those two types of trauma together, and you're all going to be on different ends of the spectrum. It doesn't make for good conversation. Usually I feel like it almost just really rips the Band-Aid off repeatedly. So I don't know that it helps people all that much, but you do sometimes find people who see things kind of the same way, and it kind of validates like your experience a bit. And it can be just kind of, for something that can feel isolating, it's nice to find people who can relate to. And so I get that. But having said that, because I see both ends of the spectrum in those groups, I have actually seen people who will say things like that too, like positive stories only, or I'm just trying to channel positive things into my next delivery, or things like that. And I do feel for people, because they, especially in these groups where they've suffered some sort of, and sometimes their trauma isn't even related to their birth, but their birth might have like brought out previous trauma or things like that. And maybe like, anything related to their pregnancy and birth otherwise kind of ripped the Band-Aid off of maybe other trauma they experienced outside of their pregnancy. So I do feel for people, because they are thinking like they just want some sense of control, and they are thinking that they can bring that. And I get angry at the people who tell them that that's the case, though. So I feel for the people who are just latching on and just want the positive stories because they truly are believing that. But I get angry at the people who assume a role of even like one of the providers that are the birth keepers and things like that, and they come on and say that, and they're just holding space for your birth, but they're coming on and telling you that you only have to have people in your space who are bringing you birth giving energy and everything, and then they set people up to fail. So I think that it helps to understand where people are coming from when they're thinking that, spreading that information, because there's usually some sort of incentive for them to spread that information. They run a business out of that, or they're claiming to be the holistic birth keepers of your sacred space while you give birth, and for the small tune of $4,000 for your pregnancy, and they're very incentivized. And yeah, for in that sense where they're like, okay, I'm not going to allow other people in your space, only these people. They kind of isolate you for whatever outcome so that they can turn the narrative to what happens no matter what. Blame you if it goes wrong, celebrate themselves if it goes right. It's a whole cycle.
We had in a group recently a post that came out, which we did not approve. And it said something along the lines of who had a uterine rupture, what were your intervals, were you induced, and everything like that. And we kind of talked it over in the admin group. And it's just like, this person did not mean any harm, but it's also when we allow that post in the group, we're asking for our members to, to recount their trauma over and over and over. So it's within these groups, it's a balance of what we approve and what we don't. And usually we'll throw up a post like something along the lines where they can learn a little bit instead of asking these members. And we've had, and I know you know it, Megan, and I've asked Megan before, I'm like, please let me know if I don't need to tag you in these posts, because there's a, you do want to help people, but it can be traumatizing. There's just some days you're mentally exhausted and don't want to recount that, and that's okay. So we try in these groups to be mindful of the post going up. And like I said, this person did not know and did not mean any harm, but it's also like putting the blame on the people. Like, what did you do wrong? Did you not wait this long? Did you wait too long? And that type of stuff. So when we post these in the groups,
I appreciate that you do that. And then I would say too, though, sometimes, so with her, so I agree, she wouldn't mean any harm by asking it. But if you ask, if you think of other people who've suffered a uterine rupture in our group, so take like me and take Caroline and all of us, we all have we're going to have different answers to that, but we all ended up with a uterine rupture. Some of us we had different spacing, we had different age, we had different health risks going into it. We had all different scenarios and different pregnancies, and we still both ended up with a uterine rupture. So sometimes it's that's where that whole trickiness around asking for medical advice in the groups, it can get dicey, because they're not overtly asking for medical advice, but they are somewhat taking that information to be like, okay, well, let me see if I can find any patterns between these people who've had this outcome I don't want to have. What did they do? So you're right, to some degree, they're inadvertently being a little bit blaming around it, because they're trying to find something, from a self-preservation standpoint, like, well, what can I do differently? What did they not do? Or what did they do that I shouldn't do? But also they're trying to take people's anecdotal experiences and blanket on over their own individual circumstance, which is apples and oranges, and say like, okay, well, I have XYZ, so
I'll be okay.
It happened to me.
It wouldn't happen to me. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what that person was doing. As much as they probably were curious of like, why do we have ruptures? Probably should have just asked, why do we have ruptures? Like, why does it happen? Instead of just being like, you know what I mean? Like, what happened of how you found it? What happened with you? Because that's exactly the same thing. They're looking for, what can I do or not do to avoid a rupture? And that's just not how it works.
Yeah, really the answer to that is to be at the hospital when you go into labor, past dates where, utilize electronic, continuous fetal monitoring to, or any symptoms you do feel if you feel them, all of those things, to have a legitimate care provider in a hospital with a level 4 NICU, all of those things, none of them will prevent your rupture. They will just help detect it soon enough, hopefully, if you do have one. So those are the things that I wish people ask just more questions. They don't. Nobody goes in really asking, instead, how can I prepare for this? Like, what should I do to keep myself safest in that scenario? Or like, how can, what is the most evidence-based practice for this? I wish they would ask those types of questions versus just trying to avoid the outcome they don't want, because even rupture is just one example. Like, there is a ton of things that you just, preeclampsia or any other types of things you just can't, there's not much you can do. If your body is going to do it, it's going to do it. So you just have to kind of try to be in a safe place with safe caregivers, with good credentials, following evidence-based practices. And if you have a good care provider, hopefully they're already doing that.
I guess we should note, like, a lot of us are coming, speaking on part of being in birth groups, and mainly, or in a lot of VBAC groups. I know, like Megan, you said you're in some birth trauma groups, but when I'm speaking, so when we talk, like, the biggest risk for a lot of these groups that, I help admin are ruptures. So that's why we talk a lot about that.
Sure.
But I just want to say that, but it, like Megan said, it could be, preeclampsia. There's a lot of other things that we can't control, and being in the safest place is best. And yeah. And, and we see that with the medical advice too, in these groups, some people will ask like, well, how long can I stay home before I go in? Because in their minds, in other groups, they've been told the longer you stay home is the best way to prevent having any, what is the word I'm looking for? Medical assistance, maybe, if they're going to give you Pitocin.
Cascade of intervention.
Thank you. Cascade of intervention. So the longer I wait at home, the less time they get to do this. And they always think that these hospitals are rushing you to have a baby. No, they want you to have the safest birth. They want to let you have a vaginal birth if it's safest for both you and baby. That's the main goal. And then, of course, when that doesn't happen, they want you and the baby to be the safest. But again, in these groups, we do see, and especially talk about a trial of labor after C-section. People come on and post like, how long can I wait at home? And we always, we can't give medical advice on that. Number one, they need to talk with their provider, and they can take into consideration, like I know we have some rural people that live farther away, like no, on your contractions you start in, or when you start getting regular, like they'll tell you. There's a general guideline that we usually post in the group, and it's always safest. Just go to labor and delivery. I know we said it in the previous videos. Just go into labor and delivery, get checked out, get hooked up to a monitor, and then they can kind of assess you and then get you in. They're not going to keep you if you're not in labor and say, oh, let's just induce to have this baby. It's not what they're about, So that's why in a lot of groups, when you ask for medical advice, and maybe you're not even realizing you are, we usually always say, talk with your provider. And I know that gets redundant and people don't like that, but really, we can't be giving medical advice as well. Even if we have some doctors, OBGYNs, and certified nurse midwives on our team, and they cannot give medical advice either online. And that's not what these groups are for. That's what your provider is for.